Early this morning, Russian troops invaded Ukraine, a free and sovereign country. And once again, in the center of Europe, innocent women, men and children are dying of fear for their lives. We condemn this barbaric attack and the cynical arguments to justify it. It is President Putin who is bringing war back to Europe. And in these dark hours, the European Union and its people stand by Ukraine and its people. We are facing an unprecedented act of aggression by the Russian leadership against a sovereign, independent country. Russia's target is not only Donbas. The target is not only Ukraine. The target is the stability in Europe and the whole of the international peace order. And we will hold President Putin accountable for that.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. That was Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission. War in Europe. After denying for months it had planned to attack Ukraine, accusing the West of anti-Russian hysteria and distortion of intelligence information, President Putin last week held a bizarre meeting with his Security Council. And as if he wanted to get each member to dip their hands in blood, say one of our interviews, he got each minister from defense to deputy prime minister to intelligence chiefs to announce publicly they supported the recognition of separatists in the Donbass in Ukraine. The first step towards annexation of eastern Ukraine. That's what it really was. Putin railed against the West in Ukraine, accusing NATO of harboring and protecting Nazis, of Ukrainian leaders of being Nazis and drug dealers, and he ordered his army to storm into Ukraine from 3 directions. He said he wouldn't occupy cities, and that his military action was limited. Within hours, as if you could forecast what Russia would do based on what Putin said he wouldn't, Russian missiles hit targets across Ukraine. Russian forces have targeted Ukrainian cities in every corner of the nation. Tanks and soldiers from Russia are pressing in on Kiev as I talk to you. And the leadership of Ukraine, President Zelensky, may only have a few days left, maybe only hours. And Ukrainians are fleeing in the tens of thousands into Western Europe for shelter. The story is changing fast. I'll walk you through Putin's mental state and talk about what long-term Ukrainian resistance could be in the cards, as the struggle between Russia and the West is played out in a major European country, Ukraine. All right, joining me now is Bill Browder, who is the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, the investor advisor to the Hermitage Fund, which at one time was the largest foreign portfolio investor in Russia. His business was basically stolen by Russian officials. His lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, died in prison after being denied medical care. Hi, Bill, and you can amend that introduction with anything you want.
So he died after being tortured for a year after he exposed Russian government corruption.
So you must feel bittersweet, a vindication of sorts right now, because you've called for tougher sanctions of Putin's Russia for, a good decade or so.
There's not a single ounce of sweet in what's going on right now. I just feel bitter. It doesn't really matter whether I was right or wrong. We're in the most horrific, worst case scenario situation that I could have ever imagined. The fact that Putin is killing innocent civilians in Ukraine and basically taking his own teenagers and making them cannon fodder in this fight that nobody has an interest in other than him is just heartbreaking. And it will, the implications are so terrible for everybody in the world, every democracy, every freedom-loving person has to be heartbroken by this.
Do these sanctions do what's needed? Are they crushing sanctions?
Well, so when we started this whole discussion of sanctions 10 days ago, the first list that came out was on Tuesday of this week, and I would give that first list a 2 out of 10. And then on Thursday, they elevated it to an 8 out of 10. And then on Friday, when they added Putin to the list, we get to 9 out of 10. But there's still a couple things that need to be done. The first thing is that sanctioning Putin is all very good from a symbolic perspective, but he doesn't hold any money in his own name. All the money is held by oligarch trustees. And so we need to sanction those oligarch trustees who are not on any sanctions lists at present. And the second thing we need to do is we need to cut Russia from SWIFT. And at that point, we would be at a 10 out of 10. Now, a lot of people ask me, does that, if we do that, will Putin, stop any further invasion? And the answer is probably not. At this point, he's going to continue. But it's absolutely essential that we raise the cost of what he's doing to an extreme level, because at some point, he's going to want to stop the pain. And we don't know when that's going to be and how that's going to be, but you can't make him want to stop the pain if you don't inflict the pain. And so short of actually having a military confrontation with him, the best we can do is come after him economically with as big a weapon as we can come up with.
Let's talk about SWIFT. I mean, Germany now looks like they're going to give some ground on this. Do you think that it's inevitable that, given the fact that there are a lot more people going to die in Ukraine, and I hope I'm absolutely wrong, but there are going to be a lot more people that die in Ukraine. Knowing Putin the way I do, and the way most of us do, I think he's just going to keep going. There's going to be horrific damage in some of these cities. It is not going to end very quickly. Do you think it's inevitable that Russia is just cut out completely of the Western, economic sphere, and that's it? I mean, there is a new iron wall between democracies in the world and free market economies, and Russia will stand alone.
Well, I agree with you about Putin. I know him pretty well. I've actually been involved in a major conflict with him over the last decade, and I've seen how he behaves. He never backs down. He never compromises. He lies at every step of the way, and he doesn't care how bad he looks when he gets involved in a conflict. And so I don't see this going any other way other than more escalation, more heartbreak, and more atrocities. And as that starts to play itself out, he's going to provoke the most serious reactions that anyone can come up with, and SWIFT is definitely at the top of that list. And it's interesting to note that all of the apologists, all of his friends in Europe, people like Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary, who always went to bat for him, people like Zeman, the president of the Czech Republic, have all basically thrown in the towel and are now supporting SWIFT, removal from SWIFT. And so it's really, he's kind of lost everybody. He spent 20 years accumulating all these apologists, paid apologists, I should say. And in one fell swoop over a 24-hour period, he lost it all.
What does that say about Putin's view of the world that, to hell with the West, they can all be bought and sold anyway?
Well, that's true, and that's been that. But that only works if you have one foot in the civilized world, like he had before. He had one foot in the civilized world and one foot in the criminal world. And I saw the foot in the criminal world, but I also saw how he was showing up at the G20 and the Council of Europe and the International Olympic Committee and all this kind of stuff, where he was, he kind of, could speak out of both sides of his mouth. And some people would say, okay, well, he's, just a tough guy, all that, you shouldn't be so hard on him. But now there's nobody who can say that. You can't say that when he's like unprovoked, invaded a neighboring country for no reason other than sort of his own ego.
So some people would say Putin's changed in the last 2 years. He's become more isolated. He's been sitting out at his dacha during the pandemic. His inner circle has shrunk. to some pretty extreme and paranoid people. I would guess Bill Browder says he's always been like this, and he's just revealed who he is.
I don't think he's changed at all. I think he's just reacting to circumstance. And his circumstance right now is that he's been in power for 22 years, and people are tired of him. And people's lives have been not improving because of him. And he can't blame it on anybody else. He's got to just, he owns it. And as time goes on, look, in Belarus, the people rose up 18 months ago after a fake election and nearly got rid of Lukashenko. And it was only with Putin's own intervention that he prevented that. And then like a month ago in Kazakhstan, same thing. He could see the writing on the wall. He understands that, if he hadn't done anything, Alexei Navalny would probably be president of Russia. So what do you do in a situation like that? You start a war, straight out of the dictator's playbook. You start a war, and nobody's going to replace the president in the middle of a war. And so that's what he's banking on, is to stay using this war to stay in power. Nothing has changed about him. He's always been a totally, amoral, psychopathic, murdering criminal. But now he's just murdering more people. And he's doing it for a very specific reason, which is his own narrow, selfish, personal interests.
What do sanctions directly against Putin and, you can throw in Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister there, because nothing is in his name and it's all hidden through his wallets and his proxies. Does it really lead to anything, or is it just symbolic?
It's just symbolic, unless we also sanction the people who hold his money. And there's no mystery about it.
Do we know who they are?
We know who they are. Everybody knows who they are, actually. The people in the know who they are. People like Alexei Navalny have presented lists to the State Department and the British Foreign Office. I know who they are. Lots of people know who they are, and there's no mystery who they are. It's mostly these billionaire oligarchs, the big ones. And why do they hold his money for him? Because they can do it in plain sight. They're already established as rich people, and so if they have twice as much money and half of it's Putin's, no one's going to ask any questions.
Just sum this up for me, because tomorrow it's going to be, it's evolving, and it's evolving so quickly now. But where do you think overall, big picture, we go with Russia now in the future? And this is only a chapter, but it's a horrific one.
Well, in my very pessimistic view, Ukraine is just the beginning of what Vladimir Putin is intending to do. This is the equivalent of Hitler taking the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia in 1938. I think that Putin has much grander ambitions than just Ukraine. And if he succeeds in Ukraine, then it gives him the confidence to then test out NATO and to test the theory, would America go to war with Russia to protect Estonia? And he believes that America wouldn't. He's looking back over the last few months and watching how Joe Biden withdrew 3,000 troops from Afghanistan and allowed the country to fall to the Taliban. And he's saying if America doesn't have the appetite to even keep 3,000 troops there in a non-battle situation, how is America going to enter into an armed conflict with Russia over Estonia?
Yeah, and I think that's some pretty, bad judgment, because Afghanistan is one thing, but Europe is considered everybody's back door or their homes in the West, and I don't think you can apply the same unprincipled principles.
Well, it's not a question of what you think or what I think. It's a question is what Vladimir Putin thinks, and he's looking and he's seeing that Americans don't have appetite for military adventures, and so he's going to create one and see whether we have the appetite or not.
Last question to you. I know you watched. I don't know if you watched the whole thing, but I did, where he sat with his Security Council before they launched the military action in Ukraine, and he which was televised bizarrely, and he went around Lavrov, Dmitry Medvedev, his foreign security, head of foreign security service, asking each one to commit to recognizing the Donbass, knowing full well that what the implication of that would be, it would lead to some kind of conflict. Why did he do that? And I'm really asking you because it's kind of played over and over again in my mind. You know, they all kind of, an analyst told me they all kind of dipped their hand in the blood together. But why did he feel the need to do that?
Well, it's kind of like in the mafia. To become a made man, you have to kill someone so that everybody is bound together by a common crime. And it was just like, straight out of The Sopranos type of thing, what he did there.
Bill Browder, great to talk to you, Bill. Thank you so much. And, let's hope for somehow Putin puts the brakes on and stops this. But I think we both know he won't.
That's not going to happen. So I'm afraid we're going to see some things that will break our hearts over the next days and weeks.
Right, Dr. Ben Connable is a retired Marine Corps intelligence officer, a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, a professor of security studies at Georgetown University, and he's the author of an article of Real Clear Defense, Troop to Task, a Russian Invasion of Ukraine. Hi, Ben.
Hi.
I read your article, and it's very detailed. Look, you've spent a lot of time studying a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that's why I'm so happy to talk to you. What scenarios, after you've looked at all of this and you've seen the opening salvo of a Russian attack, what scenarios do you see possibly taking place in Ukraine if you were to kind of list off the top three?
Yes, so prior to the invasion, a lot of us believed that the Russians would only try to seize the Donbass. Clearly, they've gone well beyond that. They're trying to overthrow the government in Kiev. The Russian troops have apparently entered Kiev recently and are on their way to try to find the head of government and overthrow it. So, clearly they're trying to at least take Kiev and the Donbass. They reportedly landed troops at Odessa in the Black Sea. So they're maybe trying to build a land bridge across from Russia to Crimea to Odessa and then into Transnistria, which is in eastern Moldova, where the Russians already have some troops. Russians also probably are trying to take everything east of the Dnieper River, and that would probably be their limit of advance right now. It doesn't look like they're trying to go further west at the moment.
How would you rate the initial opening hours of this battle? Look, and I understand I'm putting you at a disadvantage here, just like we are, in trying to assess what's really going on the battlefield. But there are some pretty remarkable stories of the Ukrainians fighting back and fighting hard.
There are, and that's good news for the Ukrainians. It bodes well for what might happen after the Russians complete their invasion and start the occupation phase of the war. There have been reports in the Donbass, certainly, of Ukrainian soldiers who have been in the trenches for a while fighting back against what an attempted separatist advance, which may be a different thing than fighting directly against Russian troops. We don't know the degree to which the Russian troops were mixed in with the separatists or conducted independent operations against Ukrainian frontline forces there. We all are at a disadvantage, and I'm glad you pointed that out. And I just want to urge caution to everyone reading these reports that we all know very little about what's actually occurring in frontline combat right now. So all of the experts, you, me, anybody else that anyone might listen to, are really speculating quite a bit. And so with that caveat in place, it does look like the Ukrainians fought. I had another article and asking whether or not the Ukrainians would fight, and they did fight on the outskirts of Kharkiv. They have fought on the outskirts of Kiev, and it looks like they have fought elsewhere. And so we don't know the degree to which they've inflicted casualties on the Russians. There have been videos of planes being shot down. Those are hard to really verify because it could be Ukrainian planes in some cases. It looked like at one point a Belarusian helicopter was shot down. But all of these things are kind of in flux. The bottom line is that they didn't just roll over and that the Russians are having to push their way through into Kiev and Kharkiv and the other major cities.
Do you think that the Russians made some critical errors on the way into Ukraine and the invasion? They didn't steamroll with a lot of armor. in huge force numbers. They tended to break up their forces and attack from different directions. That's what it looks like right now, anyway.
Attacking from multiple directions would make sense. What surprised me, and again, my information is incomplete, might be incorrect, but what surprised me is their failure to topple the government immediately, their failure to really undertake effective sabotage operations inside Kiev, inside some of the major cities. It doesn't look like they had a strong agents in place operations there. And so some of the things we imagined might happen, this kind of lightning strike by Spetsnaz operators, really didn't play out the way I think the Russians might have wanted it to. And so that was probably it might have been a setback for the Russians, or a minor failure. We'll find out later. In terms of the fighting, what also surprised me and some other analysts is the restraint that the Russians have shown with their artillery and rocket fire, even though they have unleashed a lot of rocket fire and artillery, have killed civilians. It wasn't this kind of Soviet-style smash and roll operation that we would have expected. And so the volume of destruction, even though it's horrible, is less than perhaps we would have expected ahead of time.
Well, I guess there's some reason in that, isn't it? Because if Putin intends to go for regime change, the less damage he does to the civilian population and civilian areas, the more advantageous it is to him to try and win over people, which I think he's going to have a very tough time doing anyway.
Yeah, so maybe the story is of Russian restraint, which would be a remarkable show of discipline, because the Russians,
they're not known for it.
No, they're not known for it at all. And they certainly didn't show it in Chechnya. They haven't shown it in other places. In Syria, they're killing civilians by the thousands with unguided munitions. So the Russians don't care about civilian casualties, or have demonstrated that they don't care at the national level, at least. So if this is a show of restraint, then it is a remarkable one. I don't think it's going to pay dividends anyway. It doesn't look like the Ukrainians are all that happy to see the Russians invade their country.
They're going to try to take Kiev. They may well do it. They're going to go for regime change, possibly, prop up a puppet government. What would you say about that? I mean, what are the chances of success now?
I think the chances are good. Kiev is a sprawling, large city. I've never been there, obviously just looking at pictures, but that's difficult. And an operation in urban terrain like that can tie soldiers down for weeks, months, potentially even years, going into an insurgency. But because the Russians have, at the end of the day, overwhelming military capability, even though the numbers aren't the same, and the Ukrainians waited too long to mobilize their reserves, and I think they'll look back on that with regret. Zelensky was not quick to the gun in terms of getting the reserves mobilized. And on paper, I think they have something like 900,000 reserves. And if they'd been able to mobilize just half of those, they might have been able to slow the Russians even further and perhaps set up effective defenses in Kiev. And they decided not to do that. So I think the Russian chances of success are high. I don't think that the government is going to be able to hold out for a very long period of time.
What are the challenges of an occupation force in a country of 44 million people? And, given the dynamic between Ukraine and Russia right now, which is not very good.
They can occupy it. Whether or not they can do so successfully is the question that I raised in that article.
What are the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, the challenges are significant. I just looked at a line of advance up to Kharkiv and down to the river. And so they've bitten off much more than that. And I was looking at 17 million people, 17 million Ukrainian citizens, about 183,000 square kilometers, if I remember correctly. And I estimated that it would take 83,000 Russian troops to do several things. One, defend the perimeter of their advance against encroachment from Ukrainian unconventional warfare operations, Ukrainian Ukrainians in exile or in diaspora who might want to come across the border and kill Russians, undermine Russian military operations. Internally, an insurgency that they would have to try to control and defend against, defending their lines of communication, keeping their trucks from getting blown up, their soldiers from getting shot, et cetera. And then managing internally displaced persons, dealing with the economy that they've now destroyed in Ukraine and having to feed millions of people. These are all major undertakings that I'm not sure the Russians are prepared for. And they have if they're successful and they go all the way to the Dnieper River, I mean, that's a big chunk of territory and it's a lot of people. And it's something the Russians have never done in that volume before. There's an article today by Chris Miller in the New York Times about how the Russians have been successful in their military operations. They've never done anything like this in the post-Soviet era. So this is a new adventure for them, and it may be one that they regret.
Okay, you're saying 83,000. If they take that whole separatist area, which is another 2/3 in addition to the third that the separatists actually hold right now, and that's to the Dnieper River, what if they go to Kiev, troop to task, as you put it? What will that do to the Russian army?
Yeah, I'm doing that calculation. They're in.
You just cut out for a second, but you came back, I think.
They're probably going to have to field something like 100,000 troops. I mean, I have to do the calculation. So I provide in that article some baseline analyses.
100,000 in addition to the 83,000 in the other area.
No, I think total. I would have to go in and look at it, but holding down Kiev itself is many thousands of troops. I mean, if you go back and look historically at efforts to hold down a city against an insurgency, if there is an insurgency, and that's the big question, it's thousands of troops. I mean, Ramadi in Iraq in the early 2000s was a city ostensibly about 500,000 people, really probably about 300,000 or 250. And it took about 5,000 U.S. troops to hold down Ramadi. Kiev is 2.4 million people, and that's a significant difference in size, scale, scope, and threat potentially. The question remains: is will the Ukrainians continue to fight? Will they put up a real insurgency? Will they force the Russians to maintain that physical presence and conduct counterinsurgency operations in the occupied territory? And then the other question is, are the Russians going to stay? There's some speculation that the Russians may overthrow the government, destroy the Ukrainian armed forces, and leave and call it a victory, knowing that they're not ready for the occupation. So that is also something that might happen. That's pure speculation at this point.
The danger, but that is if that's Putin's real goal, is to stop Ukraine from ever becoming a NATO member, just to completely disarm Ukraine. If you just hit and run, you're right back in the same movie with Ukraine aspiring to the West, within a year.
It doesn't play out well if you start thinking through all the permutations of the departure or staying. I mean, the aftermath of this invasion doesn't look good for Vladimir Putin. We could, of course, experts like me could be proven wrong. This could turn out to be the most brilliant thing he's ever done, and the occupation could go very smoothly and be a great success. But the odds, based on historical precedent and on the volume and scale of the challenge that he faces, and on the demonstrated Ukrainian will to fight so far, suggest that this is not going to go well for him.
And what does not going well look like?
It looks like having to keep tens of thousands of Russian troops pinned down inside of Ukraine, suffering under regular attacks from insurgents, shooting his soldiers, blowing up their vehicles, undermining their operations, and then seeing support for the war ebbing back home. And, there have been some discussions. There were some yesterday. I provided insight into this, and so did, better experts like Mick Mulroy, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East and a special operations guy, saying that this is a great opportunity for the United States and perhaps NATO special operators to conduct unconventional warfare operations against the Russians through the Ukrainians across what will become the new boundary.
Important point that the Ukraine resistance would not be standing on its own, but it would have tremendous resources coming to it from Western European nations and from, the United States and Canada and many others?
I would put a caveat on that and say they might have that support. I mean, applying unconventional warfare is risky and it requires political will. And I'm not sure that we have that political will. That's a decision that we may never know about because it requires a covert action, probably require a covert action finding in the United States. It's very difficult to get NATO to agree on kind of high risk operations like that. So that remains to be seen. But
it's been stated very clearly by countries like the UK that they will not allow Putin to win here and that they will step up and supply more arms to Ukraine. So I think it's not very overt. The intentions are not very covert. I think the intentions are pretty overt.
Maybe. I heard a lot of tough talk about what we would do in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, and we wound up running away. So I'll believe it when I see it.
How does a resistance work if there is a defeat, if they decapitate the government in Kiev within the next few days? Where does the resistance operate from and how does it work?
So that's another good open question here, and something that we don't have public insight into is the degree to which the Ukrainians have prepared networks and stashed weapons, put weapons caches and communications caches, and made these things available for an organized resistance against the Russians. If they have prepared ahead of time and they have networks in place, they have cells, they have leaders, they have people who have been trained. We saw that militia were training to fight against the Russians. We don't know if those militia or others have been preparing for an active insurgency against them. That would give them a head start. Otherwise, they're in what's called the proto-insurgency phase. There's a great article by one of my colleagues, Dan Byman, that's free online to read at RAND about a proto-insurgency. They're vulnerable. And they can be stamped out. Despite the fact that urban areas are hard to control, occupiers do have advantages in urban areas because of concentrations of forces. So there will be challenges there if they have to start from scratch, and we'll see how well they're able to get this off the ground.
Does it matter to you? Not to you. Does it matter to the success of a resistance or insurgency, if you want to call it that they hold Western Ukraine and they're able to operate from them, or can it be transferred to NATO countries, which politically poses all sorts of problems?
It's critical that they have territory on Ukrainian soil that they're able to operate from, and that they have Ukrainian people and cities west of the river that they're able to draw from in order to support the insurgency, and also to keep the hope alive that there will be a democratic Ukrainian government in the future. Hopefully that democratic government will transfer to the West at some point, even if its leader is captured or killed. And so there will be this core of resistance and capability that the West can leverage, but that the Ukrainians themselves can leverage to try to get the Russians out of their country.
Last question to you. Do you want to make a prediction on how this may go in the next week?
I'll make a forecast. I'm not. I'll be vague. I think anybody that predicts what's going to happen is probably not wise. But I think that the Russians are going to succeed. They're going to control territory. It will be uneven. There will be parts of the country that they don't control effectively. They will find that they don't really have complete control over even the parts that they think they do. It will ebb and flow a little bit, but we will see a transition into an insurgency. I will not predict or forecast whether or not the Ukrainians are going to fight that insurgency. That's up to them, and the future of their country is in their hands right now.
Dr. Ben Connable, great to talk to you, and thanks so much for your insight.
Thank you.
All right, Ian Bond joins us now, and he is a Director of Foreign Policy at the Center for European Reform. That's the official title. But Ian, I know you have a lot of experience in the field as a former diplomat, including being based in Russia at one point, in Washington, and looking at European European security. And that is certainly the topic of the day.
Yeah, it is indeed. Yes, you're right. I mean, I was in Moscow in the 90s, but I have been following European security for a long time.
Your reaction to Putin's invasion of Ukraine today?
Well, I'd like to say that I was surprised, but I wasn't. I've been saying really ever since this build-up began that this was the most likely outcome. It seemed to me very unlikely that Putin would put this amount of force on the borders of Ukraine if he wasn't intending to do something with it. I think probably he hoped that the West would bully Zelensky into making the concessions that Putin was looking for. But if that didn't happen, and it didn't, then Putin was prepared to launch an assault, and that's what we saw this morning.
Do you think President Putin is thinking clearly?
No, I don't. I'm not inside his head, so that may be an unfair judgment. But I read the 5,000-word essay on the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people that he wrote last summer, and I thought we were in deep trouble from that point onwards. This was a argument for Ukraine having no right to exist as an independent state. And I know that the American historian Timothy Snyder, a day or two ago, said that these sorts of beliefs are generally followed by atrocious acts. And that seems to me to be exactly where we are.
Why does he think that? Is it the people that have surrounded him? I mean, many people say that Putin has become more isolated in the last 2 years. The liberal-leaning, democratically minded, Western-leaning people who used to surround him in 2000 have disappeared.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think he's had these beliefs for a long time. One has to remember that back in 2008, he told George W. Bush that Ukraine was not a proper country. In 2013, at an international conference, he told my boss at the Center for European Reform, Charles Grant, that Russians and Ukrainians were one people. So he's had these beliefs for a long time. And interestingly, Professor Timothy Garton Ash from Oxford University was saying that he met Putin in the 1990s, in the mid-1990s, long before Putin became a sort of national figure in Russia.
When he was a deputy mayor in St. Petersburg.
Yeah. And even Putin was talking about the fact that the Russian people had been sort of torn apart by the establishment of independent states at the end of the Soviet period when the Soviet Union collapsed. So, I think maybe what changed is that in the intervening years, some people who say, very interesting lad, but no, not really. And maybe those people aren't there any longer. The pandemic has had something to do with that. Also, the economic liberals have really lost influence in recent years with Putin. He's fallen back on his old KGB comrades, on people like the secretary of the Russian Security Council, Patrushev, and people like that, who are borderline paranoid hardliners. People who see an American plot in everything that goes wrong in Russia.
I've covered Russia for a long time as well. And I was struck this week by the meeting of the Security Council and how Putin then aired that videotape intentionally. Why? Where he went around the room asking members of the Security Council if they support recognition of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic areas. And then he almost, he embarrassed and humiliated his foreign intelligence official. What was that all about?
Well, I took that as, basically getting everybody in that room to dip their hands in the blood so that none of them would be able to say afterwards, well, I spoke up to oppose this. They are going to find it harder to pour themselves in the future as, I was the liberal in the room, you can do business with me.
And I would ask you about this videotape that he made as the attacks were launched early this morning, probably around 5 o'clock in the morning, Moscow time. where he warns the West, saying you'll face consequences greater than any you faced in history. Was that a nuclear threat?
I mean, it's not entirely clear, but it certainly sounds like that. And I think it is stunning. It is absolutely stunning. But again, he has been telling us for some time about his amazing terror weapons and how we should all be frightened to death of them. So, in a way, like so much that Putin has done in the last few days, it's shocking but not surprising. I think we need to take it seriously. But equally, NATO is also a nuclear alliance, and I think it's important actually at this point that NATO, from top to bottom, and national leaders should be signaling to Putin that he can't have unilateral nuclear deterrence. He can't basically say to the West, I can do what the hell I like with my conventional forces because I've got nuclear weapons and you can't do anything about it. He needs to be told, we've got nuclear weapons too. Watch what you do.
And who's going to tell him that? President Biden?
Well, Biden has nuclear weapons. He has a football. Macron and Johnson both do as well. The NATO Secretary General doesn't have his own nuclear weapons, but he speaks for 30 countries, and 30 countries that have relied for their peace throughout the Cold War, certainly, on nuclear deterrence. I think it's very important that message gets through to Putin.
And what would you say?
We can't be put in a situation where we can be blackmailed by the fact that Putin has nuclear weapons.
I see the former U.S. ambassador to Moscow, Mike McFaul, said, thank God that NATO expanded and took all those countries into NATO. So he's somebody that sees NATO as now so essential for protecting Eastern European countries that are close to Russia, that feel threatened, like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. There are others that will say we should never have promised Ukraine possible membership in NATO. And that was the mistake. And we should have promised Russia that Ukraine would never be allowed and Georgia would never be allowed. How do you see it?
I don't think you can roll back history. There was a debate to be had at the time about whether there were other ways to accommodate Russia in a European security system. But once the democratically elected governments of the Central European countries had applied for and received NATO membership, you can't say, well, would have, could have, should have. We are where we are. I think those countries would be in a much, much worse position now if they were trying to deal with Putin and they were not members of NATO. I don't think that the problem for Putin is NATO as such. The problem is that his neighbors are not under his control. And the great American Russianist Kremlinologist George Kennan wrote long ago in the 40s that Moscow, I paraphrase, but said that Moscow sees its neighbors either as enemies or vassals. And if you don't want to be one, you have to be the other. And I fear that that is still true for Russia's neighbors today.
And in fact, Prime Minister Medvedev used that exact terminology when he wrote a piece this summer saying that Ukraine is a vassal state. But let me ask you, do you fear direct NATO conflict with Russia? Because while NATO is not going to put boots on the ground and they're not going to intervene militarily, directly, they say, you have NATO countries that bilaterally will support Ukraine by sending weapons, training, and other means, including a resistance, if it comes to that, an armed resistance across Ukraine. Isn't it inevitable that Russia, if that resistance proves formidable, will move to cut it off? And that means possibly confronting a NATO country.
There are real risks in the Black Sea, where Russia is clearly trying to control the Black Sea, which it shares with NATO member states, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. So these risks are there. They're real. It's why I think that Western leaders should be warning Putin, don't do your to regret.
Don't do something you'll regret.
Yeah, absolutely. But the risks of confrontation are very real.
All right, Ian Bond, thanks to talk. Good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
And that's our backstory for this week. Sanctions are going to cripple Russia. Putin is a pariah, and his legacy will be launching this bloody war against his neighbors, never to be forgotten. And could this be the beginning of the end for the Russian dictator? Because even most Russians don't believe his anti-Ukrainian lies about Nazis and threats to Russian security. They don't want to kill fellow Slavs, and many families, Ukrainian and Russians, are mixed with relatives in both countries. They are torn apart by what's happening. In the name of Russian security and stopping NATO expansion, Vladimir Putin has just brought more NATO forces to his borders than ever before, as countries from Poland to Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia fear they could be invaded next by imperialist Russia. The free world is now on a mission of containment of Russia. Has Putin changed or just revealed himself in his desire for the great unraveling of European security and his thirst for more power? I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening to Backstory. Share this podcast and I'll talk to you again soon.